Hello, everybody. Welcome back to this week's episode of The War Room, part of the Clonestar podcast. I am your host, Mike Overton, and joining me in the co-host seat this week is my wonderful Irish co-host, Joseph Hurley. How are you, sir?
Hi, Mike. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Now, our guest this week, I am super excited to announce. It is a Emmy award-winning screenwriter and executive producer of Star Trek Prodigy. It is. I'm going to have to do that again. Aaron, how do I say your surname?
So if you were in Germany, it would be Waltke, which is very aggressive. So my ancestors, when they immigrated to America, decided to change it to Waltke, like Walt Disney's key.
Okay, that makes sense. I'm gonna have to do all of that all over again now because
Now, Mike, and I gave you that chance to do the intro, and this is how you repay me.
I know, I'm sorry. Anyway, let's try that again, shall we? Hello, everybody. Welcome back to this week's episode of The War Room, part of the Clone Star podcast. I am your host, Mike Overton, and joining me in the co-host seat this week is my wonderful co-host, Joseph Hurley. Show, how are you?
Hi, Mike. How are you?
Good, thank you. Now, our guest this week, we are truly excited to have on. He is an Emmy award-winning screenwriter and the executive producer of Star Trek Prodigy. It is Aaron Waltke. How are you, sir?
Hello. I'm quite well, thank you.
Awesome.
Glad to be here.
Well, thank you for being here. Do you know what? Star Trek Prodigy is just one of those shows that I think if you haven't fallen in love with it, there's something wrong with you. It's one of those shows that, yeah, it's quite funny. My partner isn't a massive Trekkie, and it was the first show that he got into for some reason. I was sitting in my office one day, and all of a sudden, the Prodigy theme tune's going on in the room next to me, and I poke my head next door, and he's there just watching it of his own accord. So he's now finally got through all of Lower Decks and all of Voyager, and we're getting through Deep Space Nine. So I have the Prodigy to thank you for turning my partner into a Trekkie. So thank you.
Hey, working as intended.
Exactly.
Actually, Aaron, just on that point, then, since Mike's partner got into Star Trek through Prodigy, if you were introducing somebody to Star Trek, what 3 episodes, or say including a movie, would you say to someone, watch those and you'll get an idea of what Star Trek is like?
Gosh, I mean, it's such a tricky question, and it's partially why we created Star Trek Prodigy was because, I've been a Trekkie my entire life, and I do often get the question of like, my partner or my nephew is like trying to understand Star Trek. Where do we start? And the answer used to be like, I don't know, watch 100 episodes of TNG and you kind of get the vibe of it after a while, because like TNG was meant to be sort of like a starting place out for quote unquote modern viewers, but the first couple seasons are a little, uneven, shall we say. So like I think Encounter at Farpoint is a really cool episode. It's a very weird episode if you haven't seen it in a while. Like it's like half of it is like them shopping on a planet that turns out to be a space jellyfish, and then the other half is a trans-dimensional imp that's testing them in some trial that makes no sense. Like it's very Star Trek, like because I think Star Trek is uh, by and far its best self when it is unapologetically weird.
Oh yeah.
I think that let's say there is a subsection of humanity that might watch that and be like, I don't know if I understand this show. So like as far as 3 episodes, I think it's easy to say like, oh, Inner Light, but what's interesting is that's sort of an atypical episode. Like it's a great episode because it's able to kind of go far afield of what a quote unquote typical Star Trek episode is and tell a compelling story. But if someone was completely blank slate and had no knowledge of Star Trek and you told them to watch Inner Light, so it's about a guy who quantum leaps into other people's bodies for 4 acts and realizes that time is all we have.
Oh, hang on a second. Sorry, Aaron, I have to interrupt you for a second. I was about to say, every week we do this show, right? Someone says something that ages the podcast or ages the host at least, right? When you said Quantum Leap, but I said, wait a second, there's a new Quantum Leap out there. So people might actually get it from that. So, Mike, we might not have aged the podcast this week.
Yeah, exactly. I'm hip. I'm with it. All of my references are definitely what's on Peacock right now. I mean, Quantum Leap was absolutely very influential on me, along with Star Trek. I loved all sort of television sci-fi because it was from that great golden age of, you think of like sort of quasi anthological storytelling, where each episode you had no idea where they were going to go or what they were going to encounter, and it would all kind of be sewed up in some sort of morality play or thought experiment by the end of it. But to get back to the original question, so yeah, I mean, some great ones that I think are good examples of Star Trek. One would be, I really like Darmok. I think that's a great. Again, that's an example where the captain is stranded on the planet for some time, but ultimately, I think it is at the heart of what Star Trek is, which is like reaching out to strange new life and worlds and civilizations and trying to come to some sort of understanding between them. And that's a really cool episode because it folds, ancient Sumerian texts in with the fundamentals of how do we communicate as a species through metaphor, and is there a deeper understanding we can come to, which is of course our shared necessity for survival and growth via new friendships.
And the fact that you mentioned that, I have to give a shout out to one of our biggest fans, Chris Trekken, because every time I ask the question like that, that is the episode he always gravitates towards and says that's the episode that I would introduce somebody to Star Trek with.
Totally.
It's the first time we see that cool jacket as well.
Yeah, and I think that, there's also, I think in Voyager, there's some great self-contained episodes in Voyager as well. Like, I think Distant Origin is a really interesting one because it starts from a perspective of an alien life finding, human skeletons, and then slowly it becomes this sort of Galileo metaphor of these, ancient descendants, I should say, of dinosaurs that apparently became a spacefaring race and have forgotten that they were from Earth. And it's
Voyager really had some wonderfully bonkers ideas at times, didn't it? Because and what you were saying about like with Quantum Leap, where you had no clue what was going to happen from one week to the next. That's I love the Voyager. You could have absolutely anything. Like you'd be there going, I have no clue what's going to happen in this week's Voyager. As you said, like dinosaurs, Amelia Earhart being in another episode.
Yes,
going,
like finding in 1930s like Studebaker floating through space. But I mean that was there from the beginning. Like just replace the Studebaker with floating Abraham Lincoln, and that's in TOS. Like
yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point.
Yeah, and then as far as Voyager goes, Blink of an Eye is another great one where it's sort of like a great little kind of self-contained kind of thought experiment of what happens if you encounter a world that is operating thousands of times faster than you are, and your very presence there is affecting the whole trajectory of their civilization's evolution. Is pretty cool idea, and again at the heart of Star Trek and the Prime Directive and that sort of thing.
And Aaron, when you were younger, so when you would have been watching these kind of growing up and things like that, did you find that you'd watch them for the entertainment value as a kid and you go, I was entertained by that, I enjoyed that, I enjoy characterizations. But as you got older and you'd more life experience, would you go back and watch it and go, oh my God, I see so much more in this episode now because I understand the world, I understand myself better?
Yeah, I think it was kind of a combination of both. Like anytime Next Generation came on, either in syndication reruns or airing live new episodes, I would always be excited for it, not just because I get to see my favorite friends again, but inevitably I would walk away with it with something that I didn't quite have the the language to articulate why I liked it, but I would stay up late at night. I told Brandon Braga this actually that I would stay up late at night thinking about so Data's head in Time's Arrow was found in a cave, and they just took that 500-year-old head and put it back on him. So it's a closed time loop, but Data's head is like 1,000 years old and his body is like 50. And that stuff would like crank my gears and keep me up thinking about it. And I was like, I guess it works. I guess his head just might need a little more maintenance because it's a little older.
So what you're saying is, Aaron, you were that Charlie Day meme where he's in front of the kind of the clipboard with all the kind of pieces of string and all the thumbtacks going into it. Yeah.
But what's wonderful about that is those very instincts are the things that in turn, I found a group of friends who are equally kind of mesmerized by any of those sort of either existential or philosophical or science fiction sort of high concept questions that these types of shows evoke. and we would sit on the playground and debate endlessly, like how the Bene Gesserit work, or what happened to the Pharaoh fluid that was melted in Terminator 2, like that sort of stuff was exactly the sort of thing I would sit on the playground and debate with my friends with endlessly. And that sort of question and creating your own answers that are maybe were not intentionally left a little bit open-ended, especially on a show like Star Trek, were the very things that inspired me to become sort of a creative thinker and a writer, because it's like those are the very tools that you use in a writer's room of like, if you ask a question that doesn't have an answer, you and the writers have so many possibilities to explore, and that becomes sort of the bread and butter of that kind of exercise. And so that's I didn't have like the vocabulary to kind of explain that I enjoyed those sort of logic puzzles, and why I did, but I definitely took that away. And that was like the thing that I like for my entertainment. I like a mystery that has an internal logic, but also opens perhaps as many questions as it does answers about our condition, which is Star Trek through and through.
It's funny you say that, because just before this podcast, I just got off the phone with a friend of mine. We grew up together and we were two huge Next Generation fans. And I always remember he used to say it to me. He said, when you'd watch The Next Generation and something be going on, you yourself would try and say, what would I do in this situation? Like before Picard would make the decision. And he's always saying, no matter what you do, you would never get it right, because whatever Picard would do would always be right. And he'd have the exact words to verbalize it. And he was completely right, like, because it was always a way with the wordplay in, say, Star Trek. It was always a smart way to kind of approach a problem. It was never about like just might is right or physical aggression. It was always about kind of a thinking way to kind of think your way out of a puzzle, out of the problem.
Yeah, absolutely, and that was as much Gene Roddenberry's influence on TNG as anything. I think it's well documented that in many ways he kind of felt that Picard's role in TNG was very much his own, as sort of like the beleaguered showrunner. Like, we always have, like, I have a set of rules and I will follow these rules, and other characters will come up to him and offer their own suggestions. And I could point you to the meme of Worf just being told no, or being told he's wrong. And it's like a supercut that's like 7 minutes long. But that's
just like the Wesley shut up meme. That's just Wesley saying shut up constantly.
Yeah, it's a little bit like that, where I think that I think Star Trek in general has, I think, a cadence of, and I definitely, working on Star Trek Prodigy, there was an episode in particular that I wrote called Kobayashi, that was sort of like Dal takes the Kobayashi Maru test over and over and over again in a way that it's not intended to be taken.
Yes.
Like a video game. And I wound up, we wound up sourcing, original dialogue from other episodes, because we wanted to sort of showcase the original performances of these amazing characters and actors from other Star Trek series. And what wound up happening was I was like, okay, I have to like sort of puzzle together all these lines of dialogue. And I realized I started to see the code in the Matrix after watching, 80 episodes and reading like 100 scripts or whatever. I started to realize that there was like a specific shape that every single Star Trek bridge scene takes. And like, the captain or someone observes something, the captain asks for clarification, another character offers some sort of contrary opinion, and then the captain makes a decision. Another character says, here's the problems with that, and the captain goes anyway. Like there's this weird kind of structure that any Star Trek scene is expected to behave like. Just the same way that any sort of language has an alphabet, like Star Trek has its very specific rhythms. And I think that in some ways is perhaps the challenge of finding a quote unquote entry point to Star Trek, is like you only absorb those by osmosis after watching multiple myriad series and hundreds of hours of it. But it is a very fun exercise to kind of think about, of like, well, what is it about Star Trek that people like? And the answer is they like one of 10 different things, and sometimes all 10 things. And one of them happens to be that that sort of paramilitary sort of chain of command and people operating at the top of their intelligence, with full competence in their duties. And even when things don't go properly, then you get to just see that, like, oh, there are smart people at the helm, thankfully. Going all the way back to when I was a kid, it's kind of similar to my other answers. I grew up between two cornfields, so there really wasn't any concept of like being a television writer for a living. It was sort of like, oh, this is just, I watch those stories after school or whatever, and I talk about them endlessly. But I did have this impulse to create my own stories. Like I found a couple of years ago when I was digging through my childhood home, I dug out this old piece of paper printed on dot matrix paper
Oh,
to
yes.
age
Good.
myself a little bit. And it was
He's done it. He's aged the podcast. He's mentioned dot matrix paper. He's done it. I don't believe
what
it.
the hell is dot matrix paper?
Yeah.
For our younger Zoomer listeners, dot matrix paper was the predecessor to normal paper, where it would have little
Perforated
punch holes along the side of the printer that would print out in an endless ream, and then you would tear it apart along these little dotted lines.
Oh, we come across as such old people that you were actually giving an instructional video on what dot matrix was.
Fun fact, my first
what
job used to use them as job sheets, and they used to print them out the night before in a massive long roll, and I had to sit there and separate them out and put them on everyone's clipboard.
Oh, God.
I mean, it's what's old is new again, though. So I feel like dot matrix might be coming back. I think once the Zennials find out that dot matrix printers are a thing, I'm sure there'll be people that'll be ironically bringing them back.
You need to get that into an episode of Prodigy now at some point going forward. I'm just gonna slip it in there as a dot matrix paper. There it is.
Yeah.
So a holodeck episode or something with it.
So anyway, on dot matrix paper, I found an old what could only be described as like a script that I had written when I was like 6 years old, and it was very strange. But it felt a little bit like almost like Airplane or one of those sort of like parody things where it's just like jumping from parody to parody. And then like about a third of it was a Star Trek parody that was sort of like making fun of the original series versus the TNG, which apparently I was astute enough as a 6-year-old to acknowledge there was a difference between them.
Oh, wow.
So I was like writing this stuff, and I don't know who was this for. I have no idea. I think maybe I read it out loud at Thanksgiving, and all of my relatives were like, "That's nice, Aaron. Whatever you're doing, at least you're not going out and you're not graffitiing a building or doing drugs. So just keep doing that." And then my uncle, and then eventually my parents got a little like home camcorder. I was kind of part of that VHS and digital camera craze in the early to mid 90s. And me and my friends in the neighborhood, we just started taking that camera out and writing little scripts and making little completely absurdist nonsense short films. But we were kind of teaching ourselves just sort of organically, how scenes work and how editing works. And I remember distinctly, it was such a huge revelation when we realized that we could record a scene and then hit stop on the camera and then either change positions to shoot the reverse shot or make someone disappear if we had them run out of frame and start recording again. And so they call those in-camera edits, but we, at the time we were just like, oh, that's how movies are made. They just kind of, they shoot a scene and then everybody gets into the next position and just shoot it sequentially. And then hopefully it all works out. And if you mess up, you just rewind and kind of tape over the previous take. And
I suppose what's funny about that is nowadays children, that is TikTok.
Yeah, I know. Again, what's old is new again.
TikTok just stole the 90s.
Right. So that was kind of, I obviously had some sort of like demon inside me that was ready to come out, as far as like the need to tell stories, even if I wasn't doing it well or in any sort of logical manner. And eventually, like, especially when my friends and I discovered that we could get like easy A's on final projects by doing like a video about it instead of actually writing an essay. And I think that the teachers in our high school were so bemused by it. And it was a nice break for them. They were like, yeah, just that's fine.
Whatever.
Make a short film as long as you demonstrate an understanding. And it all built up to like eventually, like before I graduated senior year of high school, we had made this magnum opus. It was like almost 40 minutes long, and it was for our French class. And so it had like a huge 3-act structure. I think there was a lightsaber battle in it that we actually like rotoscoped out lightsabers the way they did back in the
Oh my God, this sounds glorious.
Please tell me you have this digitally somewhere.
It is digitally somewhere, and it's insane. The audio was bad because we didn't have boom mics or anything, but it was very fun to do that. And the whole thing was in French, and we got an A+. And my French teacher was like, "That was the greatest thing I've ever seen."
Magnificent.
Yeah. So then eventually I graduated, and then went to in college. And originally, my dad is a dentist, and one of his best friends is like a family psychiatrist and stuff. And so, and my mom is an occupational therapist, and so like there was kind of like this assumption that I would just kind of join, the medical field and kind of,
Aaron, I'm not going to lie to you. With those glasses on you, there, like that is absolutely the glasses of like an occupational therapist or a dentist. 100%.
Yeah. So like I mean, I defied my sort of genetic expectations, because there was this like I actually had signed up for a psychology major in college. And at first my dad was like, "Oh yeah, you'll take my dental practice," but I was like, "I don't know if I'm interested in that." But I did take some classes in psychology and that sort of thing, and that seemed interesting to me. So originally I majored in psychology with the idea that eventually I would join my dad's best friend's practice. And but then I remember kind of clutching my mortarboard and cap at my graduation ceremony, and like just kind of staring down the barrel of the next 30 years of my life, of just like you go to undergrad, and then you go to graduate school, and you go to doctorate, postdoc, residency. And I was just like, I remember turning to my dad and just saying like, "I think I want to make movies for a living." And my dad, to his great credit, kind of sat there for a second and was like, "Well, as long as you try your best." And then it wasn't until years later that he turned to my mom and then said, "We're going to be supporting that boy for the rest of his life."
Well, I suppose you've always got something to fall back on.
Yeah, you're right. I can always go back to school, become a dentist, I guess.
All I can think of is, Aaron, as you're going through, you're kind of talking about your kind of growing up and all the movie stuff. I just keep thinking of the Fablemans and Steven Spielberg's kind of like life growing up, because I'm there going, wow, this is almost the exact same, except I don't think he wanted to become a dentist. That was the only thing I think might have been different.
Yeah, he was like an engineer or something.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
But I did have some exposure to that as well, because my grandfather was actually an engineer. He was World War II vet. He was in the Pacific Theater as an AA gunman, at Guadalcanal and all that. But then he got the GI Bill, and instead of going to a traditional college, he went to a trade school and became what's called a tool and die model maker, like a master lathe-spin. So just sort of like the old school way of building things back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, where you're just in a machine shop and like bending metal to within a micron's degree and fitting it together into a machine. That was what he did. And he got a job at a company called Sarkis Tarzian, which, if you look it up, was actually instrumental in the development of early television. So he actually helped. He told me he helped invent the first color TV cameras, interestingly enough, that the big ones that were on the dollies and stuff. And then they sold their models to New York, the three at the time, the three big TV stations. And so he was involved with that, and then eventually got hired by Indiana University's psychology department with maybe I'm going too deep in the well, but he eventually joined the psychology department, where he worked with like B.F. Skinner's sort of acolytes and behavioral psychology. And his job was basically, they would come up sort of like what you would see on a Star Trek ship. the engineers would, or the psychologists would have a theory they wanted to test that was like, oh, we want to see how like newborn rats can navigate a maze, and then but then we want to see how they react when we drop 3 droplets of water on their head at the end of it. And we need a machine that can do that. Can you do that? And he'd just think there for a second. He's like, yeah, okay. And then he would build this insane machine that could, reliably test it. And then he got published in a bunch of like psychiatry papers and whatnot. And eventually some of that stuff wound up getting involved with the space program in the 70s and 80s. So he built inventions that, I remember in the late 80s, early 90s, we were watching footage of the ISS, the International Space Station, and he kind of pointed to something in the back. He's like, "Hey, I built that." So it was really weird, kind of like whenever we visited, I would just kind of dig through his old junk drawer, and I found like this old certificate that was like from the Russian space program that was like thanking him for his cooperation. And he was like, "What is this, Grandpa?" And he was like, "Oh, don't tell anybody about that. The NASA and the Ruski were working together at a time we weren't supposed to be, but the scientists just wanted to make cool stuff." So,
Wait a second, Aaron, did you just rumble your grandfather as a possible Russian sympathizer live on this show?
Well, what's interesting, I mean, that's a whole other topic of conversation, but
Coming next week in the Clonestar podcast, Aaron goes in depth into his grandfather's Russian links.
Right. Well, I think just despite the sort of so-called Cold War sort of dissonance between the political sides of it, there was a secondary movement among the scientists of the world to ignore all that and just try to collaborate together and use their perhaps somewhat misguided country's resources to actually further the greater human good. And I think that was part of the movement he was a part of, which is very Star Trekian in a way. And I didn't think much of it because, I grew up watching the TNG and Deep Space Nine and the original series I would watch at my aunt's house over the summers. And, Chekhov was right there on the bridge. Like, I was like, okay, he worked with the Russians. Okay. He must have known Chekhov's great-great-grandfather.
So when you were growing up and you were watching Star Trek, like, was your mom and dad into it, or did you just you yourself get into it?
Yeah, so my dad was very into it. He watched like many of his generation. He caught a little bit of it when I think it was first on the air back in the mid 60s, but he really got into it, I think, in syndication, which is when it really kind of took off and he could actually watch all the episodes and the time slot wasn't just being moved around all the time. And so he loved the original series, and when Next Generation came back, like it was an event in our house, and I was pretty young at that time, because it premiered in I think 1987 September, and I one of my earliest memories is as like a person is sitting on the couch with my dad, and I remember there was just the sweeping sort of Goldsmith fanfare was playing, and you see the saucer separation of the saucer from the secondary hull, and then I remember they were like flying away, and then there's this big sort of grid force field. And I realized years later that I was watching the premiere of Next Generation live with my dad on the couch. And of course, like I didn't quite understand what I was looking at, but I knew it was very exciting, and I was kind of feeding off of his energy. And so he kind of programmed me, I think, to say, this is cool. And over the years, we definitely watched our fair share of TNG together, and I think he took me to all the Star Trek movies I was old enough to go to. I don't know if I was quite old enough, or maybe he just didn't have a chance to take me to Generations, but First Contact, Insurrection, all those onward, we went to and watched together. And that was kind of sort of like a thing that we bonded over. Cause like, my dad is creative in his own way, but I think he was always a little bit more sort of like he loved reading science fiction and he loved watching science fiction. And he was so excited when I got to work in Star Trek myself. And, it's like, wow, I guess you were paying attention.
And Aaron, is there one memory above all that stands out for you of watching Star Trek with your dad?
I mean, I think the premiere is the big one for me. And I remember sitting, I do remember watching Time's Arrow Part 1 and 2 with my dad as well, and uh, somehow even more so than Best of Both Worlds, that cliffhanger really messed me up, and my dad had to like talk me off a ledge and be like, "It's okay, they're gonna fix time. I know they're trapped in the 19th century right now. Mark Twain's gonna help them out. Don't worry."
So, Aaron, you decided anyway, screw this, I'm not going down this road. I want to start making movies and all that kind of thing. But you said you want to make movies, but were you there going, I want to be a director, or I want to be a writer, or I want to be a producer? What did you say at this point? Or did you say, I'm just going to throw myself into it, and whenever I have the aptitude for it, that's what I'm going to go for?
Yeah, I mean, initially, like writing seemed like a lot of work to me. So I thought directing would be easier, foolishly. But then I realized that, I wouldn't really have anything to direct unless I wrote it. And so, especially through college, I took all of the introductory courses and stuff of filmmaking and film theory and whatnot. But I also just started making a bunch of short films on my own. I joined a sketch comedy troupe at Indiana University, and I suddenly found I had like this whole sort of acting company that I could mine and make these silly little short films with. And then for a lot of my classes, I could use them as sort of my actors and stuff. And for the sketch comedy itself, that was also a great lesson in how to produce good content quickly in a collaborative sort of atmosphere, because so many of the people in the sketch comedy troupe, we would put on a show every other week, which is kind of insane, like a brand new show, 2 hour long. So we would have to create sketches very quickly, and we would just have like writing sessions. It was like, all right, you come up with like 2 or 3 sketches in the next 2 days, and we'll all cast them, perform them for each other, vote on which ones get into the show. And if somebody liked one, they might say, I like that, but can you take it this direction instead? And then you'd revise it and then present it again and get into the show. And that whole process is not that dissimilar from a writer's room, where you have to just substitute sketches for scripts, and you have to come up with very funny, interesting scene work very quickly, and it's kind of for keeps, because then the next week we're rehearsing it and performing it in front of 300 drunk college kids. And if you didn't want to completely bomb on stage, it needed to be good. So it was all this.
Do you remember what was the best one of those stories that you did?
Oh, of the sketches? Gosh. So a lot of the sketches that I did were very strange and pseudo-intellectual. I remember one was it's like dissecting a frog, trying to explain it, just describe a sketch comedy sketch of why it's funny. I remember there was one that we did where it was like kind of two like old Appalachian hillbillies sitting on a porch, just like kind of pointing at whatever was going by, like, look at that dog, think he's eating something. But then over time you realize there's actually an eldritch being emerging from the woods, but they're just kind of observing it with the same sort of casual sort of country bumpkinism. And then eventually the dog was this sort of being that came out and started screaming like the quatrains of Nostradamus, and then red lights started flashing, and then it went out. Like the lights went out. And that was my favorite kind of comedy that just left you out. Like you hear laughter and then like nervous, like, ah. That was really funny for me.
So what you're saying is off the wall Monty Python type humor is what?
Yeah, I guess Monty Python was very influential on me. Kids of the Hall as well, where they'd have sketches where there was one of my favorite Kids in the Hall sketches was they were just doing like an apartment viewing. Let's see if they want to rent it. And then the guy opens the door and there's just like a squat little demon there. It was like, oh yeah, that's just the apartment demon. And he's like, I'll swallow your soul and destroy yourself. And it's like, does he have to come with it? It's like, unfortunately, yes. But I can show you the kitchen. The kitchen's very nice.
Completely glazed over. There's a demon.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Yeah.
That kind of like cosmic horror mixed with kind of the absurdity of the human condition is something that tickles me and still works its way into my writing. Even
and it's
now.
Played so straight as well. Like this is just a normal kind of fact of life. Yeah, of course. kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, what did you do after the sketch comedy setups then and things like that? What was the next kind of evolution for you?
Yeah, sure. So in college, as well as the sketch comedy stuff, I also did I worked for PBS, the public broadcasting. We had a station that was affiliated with our university, and I actually wrote and produced and directed a number of documentaries that wound up airing on PBS. And I really liked sort of docu work, but it's hard to pay the bills being a documentarian. Not to bore the listeners, but it's a lot of like writing grants and trying to spin it as being educational, and then even then you're gonna barely make enough money to squeak by. But anyway, I at least had like a pretty solid reel as like a writer director between the sketch comedy, the short films, and the documentary work. And then I had a friend who was in the sketch comedy group with me that had moved out the year before to Los Angeles, and had somehow got a job basically writing minimum wage, writing jokes for National Lampoon for minimum wage. And I was like, ooh, that sounds like a fun first job. Um, but I held off because I was trying to make my documentary career work in Indiana. But at a certain point, the producer I was working with was like, hey, if you can afford an $8,000 ticket to Uganda, maybe we could film this and maybe we can sell it afterwards. I'm like, dude, I'm a broke college kid. Like, what? I don't have $8,000, let alone $8,000 to spare.
Let me just open up this mystical pot with all of my money in and just see what I have lying around. Yeah.
So that was when I was like, okay, I think I gotta just take my chances in LA, because like even if there's a 2% chance of success out there, it's better than the 0% chance of staying between my two cornfields. So I I moved out there, and I contacted my friend at National Lampoon, and he was like, yeah, I can't promise anything, but I certainly can have you come in and meet everybody. And when I went in there, I saw that they had these stacks of what then were called mini DV tapes, but basically just like recorded tapes of sketches that they had shot, but they didn't have anybody on hand to edit them. And so I was like, well, I mean, I'm not doing anything. I could take a crack at it if you want. And so I digitized the tapes and used my sketch comedy knowledge and my documentary knowledge to kind of create sort of what you would call a field segment, like what you would see on Conan O'Brien or something. And they were like, oh, that's great. And they uploaded it to this newfangled thing called YouTube, and it went viral. And then they were eventually the editor-in-chief of National Lampoon came down and was like, oh, you did all that by yourself, huh? And I was like, yes, I did. And long story short, I did it a couple more times and it was doing very well. And I was like, look, you clearly need somebody like me around here. You don't have to pay me a lot, but just pay me something, and I'll gladly work here. And that was my sort of entree into Hollywood. Was they opened up like doing a bunch of sketches. A lot of the agencies and stuff and comedians were like recognized the power of online video, but nobody really knew what it was or how to do it yet. So I got to make a bunch of really crazy sketch comedy stuff for them. And we produced content for what was then called the College Television Network, where we would mail like 2 hours of content to local colleges, like 200 colleges across America, and they would air it in their sort of like dorm room TV.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. So that was a weird experience, because a lot of it was like sort of, I don't know if you have Talk Soup over in the UK, but like a lot of it was sort of like a comedian making fun of clips and stuff and introducing them and tossing to stuff and against a green screen. But it was fun. And then and then eventually National Lampoon, for lack of a better term, went under. And so I worked in reality TV for a few years. The biggest thing I did was I helped develop a show called Real Housewives of Miami. So that was sort of my long dark night of the soul.
Oh dear God.
My mum
was
used to
fine.
watch all of the Real Housewives stuff over
Yeah.
and over, and yeah, hat off to you for that one.
So how did you wait a second, Aaron? How did you develop that? I'm just curious, like, because like reality TV, like Jesus, I always kind of associated to the Osbournes really kind of kicking off that kind of genre. But like, how did you get to a stage where you were in a room saying, I have a crazy idea, guys, and this is what it is?
Well, I mean, so that was during that time I was working for a production company that was kind of their bread and butter was making what's called docu-series.
Hmm.
And essentially what you do is you cast just like you cast anything else. You go out and find people that seem like interesting folks that would be that a certain crowd would want to see on TV. And then you film, with them for a few days, orchestrating things for them to do, going out to lunch and gossiping, or doing, if it's a game show, doing some sort of game show challenge. Then you cut that all into like a proof of concept that's like 5 to 7 minutes long, and then you share that along with what's called a pitch deck to a room full of executives at a Bravo or whoever, and then they say, yeah, we want that, here, have a bunch of money and film more with those people. And so it is developed the same way that any TV show is developed, but the difference is instead of it being a scripted thing where you write a script and a pilot or what have you, instead it's people doing basically improv, but performing it, as an exaggerated version of themselves. It's a very like mind bendy kind of a thing that what reality TV is. There is some staged stuff, but there's also, if nobody's making them do anything, it's like they're doing everything that is happening on camera. But I
Wait a
think
second.
eventually,
Are you telling me that some of the scenes I watched in the hills all those years ago were staged? Oh
well,
my
there's
God, it's all lies. Everything I believe in is actually lies.
they're staged insofar as, you say, okay, you're all going to show up at this lunch, and maybe the producer would be like, why don't you talk about what Carly said last night, and then you let them hash that out
Oh my word.
on camera. So it's like it's kind of staged, but it's kind of not. But I think the determining factor is, especially once the episodes start to air and the people on the show realize that the more outrageous and weird they act, the more camera time they get and the more famous they become. Then it becomes this feedback loop of them like, let me throw more wine, which means people will actually answer my calls when I ask for dinner reservations.
So,
Um,
Aaron, how did you go from, well, Real Housewives of Miami to animation?
Sure. So that was my day job, and eventually I did that for a little bit, and then I eventually worked for a company called Dick Clark Productions and helped them pitch like award shows and produced some stuff like that. And but nights and weekends, I never kind of lost sight of my ultimate goal, which was to kind of write and direct full time. And so so a lot of my friends that I did sketch comedy with back in Indiana had since moved out to LA, and we did sketch comedy together here. And we formed a troupe, and we got like a house show at the now defunct IO West Theater in Hollywood. And then on the weekends, I would treat screenwriting as my second day job, basically, and write screenplays. And one of my friends who I had collaborated with before eventually got a job as a manager, as what they call a lit manager. And he said, look, I don't do this for all my friends, but we've worked together and I think you have a unique voice. How about I submit you for some projects that I think you'd be good for, and we'll see what happens. And if it takes off, then we'll work together. And so that's true to his word. He did that, and eventually I got into a room with a company that had produced, among other things, like the Stuart Little movies and the Alvin and the Chipmunks, like live action hybrid CGI movies, which made a crazy amount of money. And their bread and butter was basically like they had a big list of properties that they were interested in adapting into live action CGI movies. And I pitched on. They brought me in for something else, me and my writing partner at the time, and eventually I saw that they had the rights to a book for an old, somewhat obscure Disney movie called The Brave Little Toaster. And I was like, oh, I've seen that. I proceeded to just talk to them about how it was surprisingly good for what it was, and it had all of these great messages about appreciating what you have and taking care of the ones you love, and the evils of planned obsolescence, And I left the meeting, and our manager called us and was just like, I don't know what you said in there, but they want you to write the Brave Little Toaster movie. So, so that was sort of our first big break, I should say. But even then, that was like, until the movie is made, you don't have quite enough to quit your day job.
Yeah.
So that was kind of like that was what I did, as my second day job for a couple of years. And then eventually a script that I'd worked on made its way over to DreamWorks Animation, and they really loved it. But they were like, "This would be perfect for a project that's probably not going to go until the end of the year." And I was like, "Can you tell me anything about it?" And they were like, "Oh, well, let's just say Guillermo del Toro is involved." And I was like, "Oh man, okay, please let that happen," because I had seen The Devil's Backbone in college, and I was like, "Gosh, if I can make movies even a tenth as good as that, then maybe there's a place for my type of sensibilities as an artist." And sure enough, that project wound up being a show called Troll Hunters, which was that Guillermo had created, and it was a very small writer's room. It was myself, my writing partner at the time, and then Ashley Bradley, who went on to create Marvel's What If, and then the Hageman brothers, who had written at the time the Lego Movie and Hotel Transylvania and stuff like that. And it was just kind of the four of us, and at least initially, suddenly being put in charge of this series that had 52 episodes ordered sight unseen from Netflix. So we just were like, all right, we're in a rare position where we just get to plan our entire series. And that I did that for like 2 years straight and learned so much. I got to work with Mark Guggenheim, who kind of helped shepherd in the Arrowverse over on the CW, and Rodrigo Blas, who came from Pixar, and Guillermo himself. Obviously, he was very involved in the show. He wasn't just somebody who put his name on it and disappeared. We would call them Guillermo days, where he would just say, "I'm coming in," and then we'd spend like 10 hours just sitting with him and talking with him, and showing him everything we've been working on and planning out the next phase for the next few months. And it's hard to overstate what a significant experience that was. But that was my first TV job in a very intimate room of collaborators that were all truly at the top of their game. And from there, I was some friends of ours sold a show to Cartoon Network that was a spinoff of the Lego Movie, that they asked if I wanted to be one of the head writers on it. And then after that, DreamWorks came calling and said, we need somebody to showrun the final installment of the Tales of Arcadia trilogy that had started with Troll Hunters. And so I did that. And then as that was winding down, the first season of Star Trek Prodigy became sort of a possibility. And the Hagemans kind of at the time had an office right next door to mine at DreamWorks, because they were working on the movie that was going to be the capstone to the Tales of Arcadia trilogy. And kind of knocked on the door. I was like, "Hey, you like Star Trek, right?" And I was like, "Yes, I do." And they're like, "We just had a meeting with Secret Hideout, and they want to do like a sort of a Star Trek for that. It could be an entry point for young adults with the Troll Hunters guys. And obviously, you're like one of the three people that worked on Troll Hunters in the writers' room." And sure enough, I was like, they told me the basics of their idea, and I was like, "That's great. What you should have is you should have a character that's a hologram." And then and then I just kind of gave them some free advice, and then almost immediately this rarely happens in Hollywood, where I think they had just pitched that to Brian Robbins, who was the head of the studio at Nick at the time. And he then they pitched it to Alex Kurtzman, who loved it. And Alex Kurtzman happened to be at some event with Brian Robbins, the head of Nickelodeon. And he's like, "Oh, I love it. Okay, you have a show." And so then they had to kind of back into all right, now we have to write a pilot. And then they brought me and a few other writers in. And we started fleshing out what the story would be. And
hang on, can I take a step back for a second, Aaron? So you gave them free advice, but deep down, were you there going, "Jesus Christ, I want to work on that show. It's been my dream to work on a Star Trek show. For the love of God, please come back and give me the chance. I need to do this"?
I mean, honestly, yes. I was like, they were like, if you could work on this show or Star Trek, which would you work on? And inside my brain was just screaming, Star Trek, Star Trek. And I was like, they're both great projects.
Like while you're sitting at your desk, like surrounded by like memorabilia from Star Trek
Right.
all over, it's gone.
Yeah.
Very tough choice here. Like I'm aware of Star Trek to a small degree. Maybe I could consider it. So when you got the call, like what did it feel like inside when you were being told you're about to put your feet into the Star Trek universe, but not with something that's established? You weren't joining a show that exists. You were going to be actually creating something utterly new and something very, very unique and removed from what we were used to.
I mean, it was, I would say I was nervous, but I wasn't, because like, I was just like, oh, finally I get to play in this sandbox, and I knew the franchise so well, and it was so integrated into my DNA. I've said this elsewhere that like I've worked on a number of shows now. At this point, I've written or co-written well over 150 episodes of television, which is a lot. But no project uh, has quite felt less like work than this one. It felt more like breathing, because I was like, of course, that's how a Heisenberg compensator works. It compensates. Um, and like so the chance to do something truly unique and special, didn't feel intimidating to me, because I was like, oh, that's the tradition of Star Trek at this point, of like each series has its own really specific identity. And I was there when TNG first came out, and people were like, that's not Captain Kirk. And then Deep Space Nine came out, and they're like, they're not even on a starship. and then you fast forward like 3, 4, 5 years, and suddenly it's like, oh, actually, this show's great. And then beyond that, it's like, oh, actually, this is the best of all of them. Like it. So it's like I was not afraid of doing something new and different, because in a way I was like, a show like this, like Star Trek Prodigy, needs to exist. Because I don't know if you've been to a Star Trek convention, but lately, but the average age is getting older, and Star Wars has done a tremendous job of continually feeding the pipeline of like exposure to new audiences. Between the Clone Wars cartoons and Rebels and all that, and now the prequel movies, however you feel about them, a certain generation, like, that was their Star Wars. And that's why we had the Obi-Wan series, is because for if you can capture a child's mind or imagination at a certain age, then they will continue to keep that the sort of the pyres of Gondor alive. And I think Star Trek, more than anything, deserves to have sort of new generations introduced to it without just having their parents force them to watch shows that were on in the 90s.
It's funny you say that, because I was at Dublin Comic Con over the weekend, and I saw two, I'd say they were teenagers. They were there wearing Lower Decks uniforms, and I was there going, isn't that so bloody cool? Like they're not wearing Next Generation uniforms or anything like that. They're wearing the uniforms of a current show. That's what they're in love with, and that's absolutely brilliant. So as you said, it is about, we have to kind of, Star Trek needs to kind of, connect with a new audience and not just rely on what we've had for so long, because like that's always going to be there. It's
Exactly.
important to bring out new content as well, like, and tell new stories.
And if anything, I think that the new shows, if when they're working at their best, they're inspiring people to be like, oh, I want more of this. I should go check out what they were referencing here, or I should go. I want to see more of like this. And then what's brilliant is Star Trek fans, if nothing else, like talking about Star Trek. So you can, like, any question you have, you can find just a massive database, like whether it's Memory Alpha or there were sometimes even in the writers room where I was like, I'm pretty sure this is how warp bubbles work. I think that when you merge warp bubbles, I think this happens. And then I would Google it, and then there'd be a subreddit from 2 years ago that already had like 15 people have this conversation. They came to the same conclusion I did. It was like, oh, I was right. We can't all be wrong. So, and they would cite their sources, so then I could go back and watch the source material. It's like working in Star Trek at this point is as much like forensic anthropology as anything else, where there's sort of like a consensus of how something works. It's like, okay, what are the specific examples of where they've explained or shown how that works? What are the contrary examples? Has there been a way to rectify those two examples? And then you have to just, sometimes it's just implied but never stated, and then we get to state what everybody kind of assumes. Sometimes we get to clarify or explain something that made no sense before, but now there is a plausible explanation that happens to sync up with the headcanons of millions of Star Trek fans. So
there was an episode of Voyager, I can't remember which one it was, but it started with, I think it was Tuvok and these other people. I think they were all like telepaths, and they were going through a region of space where they were outlawed, and these people were searching Voyager. And I was there going, wait a second, Tuvok and these people are on board. Where the hell are they? Where are they being kind of kept? And I was there, wait a second. In relics in the next generation, they kept their own patterns in the transporter buffer. And then when they explained it, I was like, oh my God, this is absolutely brilliant. Like I said, this is fantastic. Star Trek strikes again. So
I mean, that's exactly the fun of it, I think. Like I believe that episode was called Counterpoint. And then and then the fact that they called back to relics, which in turn was a coup, because when relics was made, they were still kind of coming off of this mandate of like, people were afraid to reference TOS on TNG. Like, even though ironically, like the second episode is like almost a beat for beat, like remake of a TOS episode, the Naked Now or whatever. And it was, but they were like, you know what? They had people like Ron Moore that were like super Star Trek fans of the TOS series, and we're like, let's just make this all like one unified universe. There's no reason not to. And in that way, it starts to, like, I'm a big Dungeons and Dragons fan, and sometimes it is kind of funny because like they always say like, the rules can sometimes be super contradictory when you have all these different kind of spells and abilities and this and that. And it's a little bit like that with Star Trek, where there's like been so many examples and counter examples. All you need is like somebody who has a clear understanding of it all that can say, okay, this works as long as you justify it this way. and that, that the Treknobabble of it all is almost kind of part of the fun, like, because ultimately we just want to get to the fun high concept of the week. But as long as there's an internal logic, you just have to kind of let the story play out.
And like, in your role then as exec producer, what exactly did you do?
Right. So season one, as I said, I was moonlighting on Star Trek while I was wrapping up showrunning on Tales of Arcadia. So I was a co-producer and writer on season one, where I was basically just kind of a part of the writing staff and helped run the room when the Hagemans were busy with other stuff. And then, season two came along, and they asked me back to be the co-executive producer and co-head writer. So, essentially, like, I was able to be there from the beginning to craft the story and kind of help shape it, because as you know, spoiler alert, from the end of Star Trek Prodigy season one, they make it back to the Federation and are sort of find a way to have this sort of like training program in Starfleet. So the Hagemans knew that they needed like a super Trekkie like me who could kind of help navigate like all of the weirdness of being that deep in the heart of Star Trek, and how you might see that from the perspective of young people. So that was my role on season two, was sort of like helping to run the room and shape the story and pitch the show, the season arcs and stuff to the executives at Secret Hideout and Paramount and CBS and Nickelodeon. And then when effectively, that once everybody had kind of decided what we wanted the episodes to be, I would sit with the writers room and we'd break it together, and then the Hagemans would come back in and we'd all kind of decide, okay, this is what it is. And then I would help do rewrites, and then after the scripts were written, then I would sit in on the on editorial, and I would watch what are called animatics in animation, where it's not the completed animated program, but it's sort of like rough sketches with the audio of the actors underneath it. And you watch that and say, okay, is this playing? Is there something that we need, an extra line we need to explain what's going on? Do we need a reaction because the directors added this cool moment or explosion and we needed the characters to react to that? Stuff like that. Or even just like, by the time you write episode 20, maybe there's some things you've sussed out, but you're like, oh, that really should be planted or at least mentioned here in episode 5. Because you might have an idea of that's where you're going, but you have the opportunity to solidify it or tweak it. And so my job, as much as anything, was sort of like trying to hold the story of the whole season in my head and make sure that it all kind of had answers and made sense, especially as it goes through different processes. And board artists or directors might add little things, or things might get cut for budget or time, and I'm like, okay, that you can do that, but we still have to establish this in this way. And that was kind of like my role on season 2, was as much lore master as running the room.
And sorry, Mike, go on.
Just on that then, I know with things like Lower Decks, they're doing multiple episodes simultaneously. Is that the same for you? Or is it... Okay, because I was going to say, how would that play out? So if you've got to episode 20 and you're like, well, we've now got to add this into episode 3, I'm guessing that's a bit of a task to go back and maybe done something that's pretty much completed already?
Yeah, so it's the thing about animation in particular is like you can make some adjustments well into the process. It just gets prohibitively more expensive depending on how involved those changes are. So you do have to try to get it as right as possible, as early as possible, but inevitably stuff slips through the cracks, or decisions are massaged. But once you're actually writing future episodes, you're like, oh, this actually works better if we play it this way.
Gotcha.
But to your point, yes, there is a stretch around the middle of, it's called a waterfall schedule, and it's called that because you have episode 1, and then you have episodes 2 start slightly ahead of it, and then episode 3 starts slightly ahead of that, and it just becomes, and at a certain point you may be working on or doing notes on 15 episodes at the same time, which is a little saddening, and not everybody can do it. I happen
You
to
really have to be a phenomenal multitasker.
Yeah. And I have ADHD, so it helps me that way. And I'm like, oh, yeah, I'll just pick up this spinning plate over here and grab this one and put it. It also, it's not for everybody, but I happen to have something close to an eidetic memory when it comes to at least certain things. So the Hagemans are always just like, how do you remember that stuff? And I was like, I don't know. It's just rattling around.
I think as Star Trek fans, we've all been asked that question at some point or another. How do you remember that? You're going, I have no fucking clue. It's in there. I just know it's there, and that's the way it is. Aaron, question for you then. In the first season, what was your favorite moment from the first season in an episode that wasn't written by you?
And an episode that wasn't written by me. So it's an interesting question because, despite what the credits say,
you would have had a hand in other episodes as well, of course.
All the writers have a hand on all the episodes in some way or another. I personally really liked the part 1 of the season finale, Supernova Part 1, which was written by our then writer's assistant and then promoted to staff writer, Erin McNamara. And it was her first TV writing gig, and we all kind of were there cheering her on and supporting her however we could. And I think that episode came out really well. I really liked that, and I know some people have different feelings, whether they really love it or they have questions about bringing back the Brenari ensign from Counterpoint. But I really love that moment because it does speak to the spirit of Star Trek, which is Starfleet does good without any assumption of recompense. They just sort of like do what they can, assuming that it will make the world a better place, and then karmically, eventually, it comes back around. And that sort of spirit of cooperation with unrequited expectations is, I think, as good as any Star Trek idea you can come up with, of like when you least expect it, the good deeds of your past will come back and help you. I really liked that beat a lot. Yeah. Beside, oh, go ahead.
I have to ask the question. All the world's a stage. I absolutely love it. Why Garvik?
So Garifik in particular, you know, there's obviously there's a lot you can say about red shirts on the original series, but I thought Garifik was really an interesting case because the episode that he appears in, which I believe is called Obsession,
Yeah.
it's like the whole episode is built around him, giving him
Yeah.
a character arc, like a redemption. Kirk sees a bit of himself in him, and
Yeah.
just like you didn't fail your compatriots. Like it's what the only thing you need to work on is that hesitation. Like in that moment, you have to have the conviction to stand by your choices. And it really, by the end of that episode, it felt like Garivik was ready to like sit down on the bridge, like next to
that's
Scotty,
right. Yeah.
next to Chekhov. But then he's just never seen again, ever, not even in the background. And it was wild to me that it always kind of like was nagging me in the back of my head. And then when we started breaking that episode, you know, we settled on the idea of you know, there's a lot that's obviously said in Star Trek about the Prime Directive and about the nature of cultural contamination, which was something we really wanted to try to tackle in this show that is presumably introducing new audiences to sort of a lot of these classic Star Trek tropes, but putting them in like sort of a fresh spin on them. And so we're like, someone I think at one point had brought up a piece of the action, you know, with the Iosians and how like something as simple as leaving behind just a book on Chicago gangland culture suddenly transforms the entire planet into like Al Capone's Chicago. And, you know, that was something that really appealed to us. And one of our writers, Deandra Pendleton Thompson, had an idea of like, what if there was an alien planet that had heard like old Star Trek logs from 100 years prior somehow, you know, a little bit like, I don't know if you've seen the movie Contact, but there's the idea of the first signal that was powerful enough to make its way into space was, I believe, like a broadcast from Germany during World War II. And then that winds up being the code that they use to send back a message of like, here's how you build a transdimensional machine. But we thought like, what if we did something like that? But it was like somehow they found old Starship logs from like the TOS era. And then we realized they were in a region of space where they're like, presumably perhaps in that sort of their 5-year mission, we only saw about 3 years of it. So it was possible that somewhere in that 5-year mission, they could have had an adventure, you know, off camera. And then they're like, well, they're for better for worse, they're often like just leaving red shirts behind.
Oh yeah, totally. Like, yeah, forget about it.
We're like, well, which red shirt should it be? And then you know, somebody brought up the fact that there was you know, there were a few red shirts that, you know, went on a mission like that and managed to survive. And Garivik was kind of like the red shirt in that regard that survived, but then disappeared anyway. And so it all kind of, there was a sort of kismet of all of these questions that have been floating in Star Trek sort of ethos, as well as our own questions, that all kind of solidified together into, well, wouldn't it be interesting to give Garivik this sort of grand send-off for his character to show that he had kind of internalized those Starfleet ideals that Kirk had taught him about self-sacrifice and the greater good, and, you know, and perhaps the Kirky impulse to sometimes bend those rules if it meant the betterment of the people that they had inadvertently contaminated with the starship. So it wound up feeling.
One question then, right? I maybe it's just me, but I'm always curious about it. Why is it it looks like the uniform that they have of Garivik is from Star Trek Beyond.
Well, it was supposed to be a TOS uniform, but in the style of Prodigy. And I think some fans have pointed out that it does look Beyondish. But all I can say is, like, if you look at the close-up of the badge, the close-up of the badge is not a Beyond badge. And the only real difference is just the neckline.
The collar, yeah, exactly.
The collar is a little different. But if you go back and watch Obsession, like even Garavik's collar is not quite the same thickness as everybody else's. And all I can say is just roll with it and just imagine when they mounted it, it just stretched in sort of an interesting way.
So I want to just take a very subtle slip back to something you said earlier on. You mentioned that you pitched the idea for a holographic character.
Yes, that was way
Did
back
you,
before the show had even gotten
yeah.
green light.
So, in your mind, did you have a character that you wanted it to be? Was it always Janeway, or did you have envisioned somebody else just in your brain rattlings?
I mean, anytime that you have like sort of a what's called a blue sky period where like there's any possibility, you kind of kick the tires and just try to talk out every eventuality just to make sure you're picking the right one. And initially when I said, oh, there should be a holographic character, I think it was just purely from the perspective of like I love the Doctor. He's one of my favorite characters of all time on Star Trek. And I also love Moriarty in his own way and his little journey he had in Ship in a Bottle and stuff. And I was like, I feel like for the circumstances of how they find the ship of just being buried and like that is an occasion where you could have sort of like a quasi sentient character or a character that achieves sentience and goes on a journey, but also is able to be the representative of sort of Starfleet that you would need in the circumstances of being essentially refugees who discover a Starfleet ship and use it as their sort of chief modus operandi to salvation. And so initially in the very early days, we were like, well, who is this character? It's like, is it an original character who's just like a hologram that could be anybody? And then, as we kind of talked it out and we're like, well, actually it's established canon that any sort of emergency holograms on a Federation ship are usually based on people, real people. Like, and we saw that obviously with Dr. Zimmerman basing the EMH on himself, but also in Deep Space Nine, you see that when they're exploring what the next EMH model might look like, that they're basing it on
Bashir.
Dr. Bashir. So and that was a really informational experience too, because I rewatched that episode. I was like, how interesting. Like they're doing like biographical like conversations and interviews and all of that's kind of getting assimilated in, and then they're doing physical scans of Bashir and I'm like, and so then we started talking about like who would make for a great like emergency training hologram of sort of like this misfit crew that's stranded in the Delta Quadrant that have to come together and become a proper Starfleet crew, someone who's both sort of like can serve as a mentor and uphold Starfleet values even in their direst moments, but also has a sort of like maternal nurturing quality. We're like, oh my god, it has to be Janeway, doesn't it?
You talked yourself into it, yeah.
Right. And that was something we arrived at very early on. And, we always kind of kicked the tires of it, the possibility of different characters. And especially when we approached Kate, initially the question was like, we want you to reprise this character that is defined a significant portion of your life. And, is it's not a small ask of anybody, especially just like, oh, and also by the way, it's on a show that is ostensibly at least partially aimed at children. It's going to be animated. And so like there's that. I think she rightfully wanted to see some scripts to kind of like before she made her final decision. So we actually had to start writing the season not knowing if we could actually get Janeway, but but maybe we were foolish or naive or just headstrong, but we were like, it's going to work out. She's going to see what we're doing.
So there wasn't a plan B then if Kate said, no, sorry, thanks very much.
The closest we had to a plan B was just make it an original character, which, I think would have been fine, but I don't know if it would have had quite the same impact. And also just both the purpose in universe and sort of metatextually what we were trying to do with the series of introducing new audiences to Star Trek. Who better than somebody who kind of like somehow bridged that gap, because Janeway had met Picard and Cisco, and like Voyager left from Deep Space Nine and also was the last of that Berman era Star Trek as far as the timeline goes. And the only stuff we saw beyond that was just like the tiny little glimpses we saw in the Star Trek movies.
Yeah.
But those were like so focused. Like as a Star Trek fan, I was like, but what's going on with the rest of Starfleet?
There's a whole galaxy out there.
Yeah, and I think we saw one tantalizing glimpse of Vice Admiral Janeway when she launches Picard off a Nemesis, and she's like, good luck out there, Jean-Luc," and then that's it. And I was like, I think like a lot of Star Trek fans, my brain cursor was still kind of like floating like right where Voyager ended, but I'm like, what happened with all the incredible knowledge they brought back, the ship, the understanding of the Borg's destruction. Obviously, Terry was thinking the same thing with Picard, because we wound up having many conversations about how to integrate what they were doing on Star Trek Picard season 2, but especially season 3 with our show of like the kind of the aftermath of the Borg. And, we had that, episode where they find a sort of derelict Borg ship that was affected by the neurolytic pathogen that Janeway had unleashed back in the late 2370s. And we wondered like, well, what if we left it just open-ended enough that could eventually become the artifact? Because there was that question of like, well, why are there Borg ships assimilating Romulans, in after Janeway's destruction of the Borg fleet, and so there's like this. It was fun, kind of puzzle piecing all of these different things together, and like even like Borg transwarp, for instance. The question of like, now that those transwarp conduits are open, you see very tiny little glimpses, like in Picard season 1. You see them take a Borg transwarp as a shortcut. And in Discovery season 3 onward, I think you find out the couriers, even in the far future, use them as shortcuts between quadrants. And then in Picard season 3, he says like, oh, the Herodians started just showing up in the Alpha Quadrant after we destroyed the Borg. And it was like, how interesting. There's this whole other like secret narrative happening. And not to mention, like, that Voyager itself had found something like 8 different methods of traveling faster than warp 10 that
and none of them worked.
Well, some of them did.
Well, they never implemented them. Sorry, I should say.
Right. Well, even in Voyager, there's the episode Think Tank where with Jason Alexander, who was on our show, and they trade him technology for quantum slipstream, and they're like, we can never quite get it to work properly, and he just kind of like side eyes them, is like, it works. You hadn't figured it out yet.
So what would I tell you, I'm going to ask you this. I had the privilege of meeting Kate in 21, so I'm going to ask you exactly the same question. What were the challenges about bringing live action Janeway into the animated universe?
I mean, the challenges, the biggest one, I think, is just making sure that whatever we did with her character, it was respectful of where she was in the storyline, but also moved her character forward. Because in many ways, the character of Janeway that we saw was a character of someone who is essentially just trying to hold her crew together and survive.
Yeah. And
I think what we wanted to explore is like, our show takes place a good 7-ish years after she came back, and some, and it almost to me, I'm always reminded of the Tom Hanks movie Castaway, where like, he spends so many years on an island, and then eating like raw crabs and stuff, and then he comes back, and then immediately someone just serves him like a steak dinner, and he's just staring at the steak dinner like,
what am I supposed to do with this?
What am I supposed to do with this? And I feel like that's sort of like ennui, and like, okay, it's not just about surviving, but how do you thrive in that after having undergone such an experience as Voyager did. And that was one of the great unanswered questions of like, how did everybody fare after they got back to Earth? And I think really talking that out, and not only making sure that everything makes sense timeline wise, but also like relationship wise and human wise, of like, she's obviously a little bit more of a veteran now. She's been behind a desk. She's seen grave threats rise and fall. And, the question is like, what would get her back out into the Delta Quadrant? The one place I'm sure she swore she'd never go back to. And we decided it was almost certainly be someone from her crew and from her bridge crew. And, for whatever you feel about her relationship with Chakotay, they very clearly had a very sincere, intimate, like confidant relationship where I would say they were the closest of anyone on the crew, because he would just tell her exactly what he felt and like it is. And he saved her life several times, and she saved his, and like it was felt like one of those relationships that it would drag her back. But I think the question is like, how has that evolved? Has it evolved? I think there's a lot of differing opinions in the fandom of how it should have evolved. Even the books take some pretty dramatic angles that, after talking it through with Kate and with Chakotay, we kind of decided to carve our own path that still honors the fact that they all, went through this incredible experience together.
So was there a lot of was there a lot of input from Kate on that, or was it just
Yes.
kind of she just kind of let you get on with it?
Yeah, I mean, she respected our opinion, but it was the way, it wasn't that we went to her and said, what is it necessarily? But what we did is we made a decision on our end of like, where is she as a character now? And we explained that to Kate, and we said, does that pass the sniff test for you? Like someone who has inhabited this character and knows it intimately. Does that make sense? That's where she would be as a character now. And she said, yeah, you've hit it, the nail on the head. So that was very rewarding to hear that we understood the character well enough that the person who embodied her gave her, or not only a seal of approval, but was like, I'm in good hands here.
Yeah.
That was definitely the trickiest thing, was sort of like, because sometimes there is this impulse to either go so far afield that they become a different character, or you're so hesitant to change anything that the character almost becomes stultified and just becomes this sort of fossilized sort of ideal version of what you kind of remember from the shows that you already saw.
Yeah.
And, I think Star Wars has had some hits and some misses in how they update characters.
Yep.
But I think the most important thing is like, how is it compelling, and what story is left there to tell for these characters? And how does their journey with these new characters, who are ostensibly our main characters, how does that affect her as much as she affects them? And that was the perspective we came from.
And obviously, with regard, not obviously going to tell us too much about it, but what are your hopes for season 2 and how the audience is going to interact with it?
My hope is that people like just enjoy the ride. I think that it is very much it gets very Star Trek. And so like there's going to be sort of some very high concept sci-fi that you'll have to watch it as a whole to, I think, truly embrace what we're doing with it. So my hope is that as you watch it, you're like, if you have a question, you're like, I can't wait to see how they answer that, instead of just saying the plot hole, because I promise we thought about it, and the answer is coming.
So what you're saying is, Aaron, before every episode, you'll suddenly appear on screen. If you've any questions, it will be answered at some point.
If you have any questions, you can either watch the rest of the series and then come find me on Twitter.
You heard it here first, Chuck. You heard it here first, folks. He's going to answer every question on Twitter every week. There you
go. We should actually have a live Q&A, Mike, with Aaron after every episode. Just have a scrolling kind of comment bar on the right-hand side.
Well, like Will Wheaton does at the end of every other episode. We would do that with Aaron.
Mike, do you want to ask Aaron our final question?
Well, I was going to just wanted to briefly just touch on the Save Prodigy movement.
Sure.
Yeah,
I mean, obviously we went through a lot of unprecedented times just as an industry where I think the idea of removing shows from platforms and this and that was not really something anybody was expecting, and so, I will say, to like CBS's and Paramount Global's great credit, even though the nature of Paramount Plus meant that it couldn't live there, they immediately said, "Oh, we're going to start shopping this around, and we have full confidence we'll find a home for it where it can actually get a larger audience than it ever has before." And so, during that sort of nebulous time, though, there is always, I think, an importance to show that there is an audience that wants to see it. And yeah, for better or for worse, I think there is at least a significant portion of the Star Trek audience that had been putting it off. It's not that they didn't want to watch it, but they were like they hadn't got around to it, and then suddenly it was gone. And then I think there's always that sort of thought of you don't appreciate things until they're gone.
Yep.
And thankfully, we had built enough of an audience that they really kind of rallied around this campaign. And that I always felt pretty confident. Not even that it would find, not just that it would find a new home, but that the audience would support us in that, because that's built into the DNA of Star Trek fandom, going all the way back to the B. Joe Trimble and the fan club, letter writing campaigns. I was like, whatever you do, like don't mess with people's access to Star Trek, because they want it.
And what about because obviously one of the big things as well at the time was the change.org petition. Like, was that very much kind of first and foremost in your minds as well, kind of watching the numbers consistently kind of grow in that on the page in terms of signatories?
I mean, it was overwhelming just from a very personal standpoint. I think all of us were a little surprised, to say the least, of what was happening. And then to see this groundswell of support of like, we're going to follow this show wherever it goes, and demonstrating to what eventually became Netflix that this is a good investment on your part.
Yep.
It really meant a lot to us, just as the people working on the show, to see that despite everything, that it had a place in the Star Trek community. And in a weird way, almost like the Streisand effect, I think that the fact that it was taken away suddenly, there was a lot of people waking up to checking it out. And now I see posts every day of like, whoa, I just saw Star Trek Prodigy, and it's incredible. Why didn't anybody tell me about this? And I think that's happened in such a way that even 2 years after it aired, when it dropped on Netflix, suddenly it was in the top 10 of kids TV, in like dozens of countries around the world, including America and the UK and France. And I think it was #1 in Germany or something. It was just like, it was just like, I always knew it had that potential to kind of to find the zeitgeist. And it feels like, in a strange silver lining sort of way, all of this kind of brought attention to our show amidst the many, 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 many other shows out there, and encouraged people to give it a shot. And it seems like their time was well rewarded.
Yep.
And so all the efforts, I think, of the fans to sort of rally around our show and help it get the viewership that it deserves. The plane over Netflix was so crazy to me, because I was like, I know they did it with The Expanse, but I was like, we're just like the little pirate crew that could, just trying to make the best show we could, but we're not The Expanse. And
lo and behold,
and then suddenly it was in Variety and the Hollywood Reporter. It's like, wow, Trekkies, like, glad to know that they have your back. It really feels nice.
Awesome. Well, Aaron, I have one last question for you. It's super easy, doesn't take any thought whatsoever. You should be able to answer it really quickly. Aaron, what does Star Trek mean to you?
Gosh, it's really hard for me to just sort of distinguish Star Trek from me and what effect it had on me, because it's been sort of a part of me in my life for as long as I could remember, quite literally. But if I had to define it in some way, I would say that Star Trek is about embracing the unknown in such a way as it is an opportunity to better know yourself, and in exposing yourself to new life and new civilizations. Perhaps you get a better understanding of what it means to be a human, and the possibilities that we can achieve together, rather than as individuals sort of floating on a hurtling rock through the cosmos. And I think that opportunity to come together and achieve things greater than the sum of any of us, to paraphrase the great Vulcan philosophers, is a lesson that we could use as much today as any time. So I'm deeply grateful to Star Trek that that it offers that kind of view of optimism of like, even in the spite of hardship, adversity, or impossibility, or seeming impossibility, that there is always that glimmer of curiosity and hope that we can build a better future together.
Yeah.
So that's what Star Trek means to me.
Yeah, that's awesome. Aaron, thank you so much for joining us this week. Thank you to all of you for listening and watching to this episode. Thank you to my wonderful co-host Joseph Hurley for joining me this week. Remember, if you'd like to catch up more Clone Star podcast, make sure you check out our website clonestarpod.com for incredible merch and fan art and blogs written by you, our fans. Until next time, live long and prosper.
Peace and long life.
And we are